Growing up, my older brother and I used to play different board games and different games in general. But when we played board games, one of the games that we played was Risk. And because there were only two of us, we actually would each divvy up three sides. And he would play three sides and I would play three sides. And he normally won. Actually, I don't know that I ever won a game against him when it was us playing like that. But, we enjoyed it, and it's something I liked playing. And when I got to college, I got invited to play Risk, and I was playing it and found out it's different. And the reason it was different is because with my older brother and I, if we were playing and we weren't going to attack, when we said we weren't going to attack for a certain number of turns or something, we kept that. And in college, I was disappointed because I'd make a deal with someone and then they'd break it. And I'd feel disappointed because they hadn't kept their commitment. And it's one of those things, it's like you should keep your word. If you give your word, you should keep your word. You should be faithful. And the idea of faithfulness as a whole has been something that I've always thought was very important. And so when seeing passages like Hosea, where he talks about when we sin as us being unfaithful to God, it really hit me because I hated unfaithfulness so much. And yet, that's the very thing I was guilty of, that sin was unfaithfulness to God. And that's because God often portrayed his relationship with Israel and Judah in the Old Testament and with the church in the New Testament as a marriage. And about him being faithful as a marriage partner for us. And are we faithful with him? And so that's something I think about as we're getting into the beginning of Mark 10. Mark 10 has a lot of things going on, so we're only covering the first several verses of it this week, and then we'll cover the rest of it next week, and then we'll take a break from Mark for a little while. But we start Mark 10 with a look at the importance of marriage, And it starts with another question from the Pharisees. Mark 10, 1 and 2. It says, "Getting up, he went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife." And if you look, your Bible might have a note that when it says divorce, it might say send away. And some will say that it is a question of whether you're allowed to send away a wife. And this question was based on Deuteronomy 24:1, among other things. 24:1 says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house." And so it talks about he finds some indecency in her and writes her a certificate of divorce. And so there had been a dispute, apparently, in that time about what this term meant. What the term meant to say some indecency. And some said it means marital unfaithfulness. If she's committed adultery or something like that, that is an indecency. And others said, she burnt the toast or something, and that just about anything was a reason for divorce. And so when they asked Jesus, maybe this is, it says they were testing him. And sometimes when we read testing him, it's seeking to trap him, but other times it's testing him as in, all right, you claim to be a teacher, you're teaching people. What do you have to say on this topic or that topic? Let's look at how you handle some of these difficult issues. And so this may have just been a legitimate, hey, we want to know. Or it may have been, let's try and find him saying something unpopular and take him to task for it. And we get told that, when they're asking about divorce, that it's because God anticipates hard hearts. God anticipates hard hearts. Mark 10, 3 through 5. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment." And so, it's one of those things. God anticipates hard hearts. He knew that they would look for reasons sometimes to get divorced, that they would find inadequacies with a spouse. And so he gave them instructions on how to do it to be as fair as possible. In the instance in Deuteronomy 24, it's that if one man marries this woman and then decides he doesn't want to be married to her anymore, and she marries someone else and he decides he doesn't want to be married to her anymore, the first one is not allowed to remarry her because he'd already been unfair to her. And there's another instance just a few chapters earlier in Deuteronomy 21 where it talks about a similar situation. Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14. When you go out to battle against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take them away captive, and see among the captives a beautiful woman, and have a desire for her, and would take her as a wife for yourself, then you shall bring her to your home, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall also remove the clothes of her captivity, and shall remain in your house, and mourn her father and mother a full month. And after that you may go into her, and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. It shall be, if you are not pleased with her, then you shall let her go wherever she wishes, but you shall certainly not sell her for money. You shall not mistreat her, because you have humbled her. And so in this he says, if you see someone of the nations that you capture and you decide you want to marry her because you think she's beautiful, and then you decide after you're married that you're not interested in her anymore, you have to send her away. And you're not allowed to sell her just because she's not an Israelite. You're not allowed to sell her into slavery to someone else or something like that. You have to let her have her freedom entirely. Notice that in this instance, though, he just says, you shall let her go or send her away. It doesn't say a certificate of divorce there. And this will be important because some people say that when Jesus is talking about the hardness of their hearts, he's talking about the fact that they asked previously about sending her away and then a certificate. And that's not the case. We see that when Jesus is talking about the hardness of our hearts, he links it with the fact that marriage belongs to God, not men. Marriage belongs to God, not men. Mark 10, 6 through 12. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. In the house, the disciples began questioning him about this again. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. And in both of those where it says divorces, you'll see a footnote again that says sends away. So even when it talks about the woman, it talks about her sending away her husband, which would not be the culture there. So it's clear again that this is talking about the formal divorce proceedings. And the thing is, he says it belongs to God, not man, that God is the one, when they get married, when they become one flesh, that God is joining them together. That this is something that was set in place from creation, from before the fall. He quotes from Genesis 2, before sin entered the world. He says, if God has joined them, let man not separate. And so marriage is important because it is sacred before God. It is God-given, and thus it needs to be respected. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. He says everyone is to honor marriage. Talks about adulterers. Obviously, that's if there's someone who is married having sex with someone who is not their spouse. That is adultery, and God will judge that. But it also mentions fornicators, which fornicators is a general term for sex outside of marriage or sexual immorality. And since sex outside of marriage, when you're married, falls under adultery, fornication actually refers to, among other things, premarital sex. That when he says marriage is to be held in honor by all, it is that even those who are not yet married are to honor marriage and not defile the marriage bed before they get to it. To treat it with honor and respect. And that's because of how important marriage is to God. Marriage, again, was instituted before the fall. It was part of creation when creation was very good, before sin entered the world. And so it's important to honor marriage. And divorcing takes away that honor from marriage and treats marriage with dishonor. It treats the commitment that has been made, the covenant that is made, with dishonor. And right after this, we also get a glimpse of the importance of children. The importance of children. We see that the disciples saw a nuisance. Mark 10, verse 13, it says, "And they were bringing children to him so that he might touch them. But the disciples rebuked them." So parents are bringing their children. They see Jesus. Jesus has been teaching people, and they're like, oh, let's bring him to Jesus. And they're just like, look, he doesn't have time for your kids. He's got more important things to do. He's got adults to interact with. The disciples saw a nuisance. But Jesus saw a priority. Verse 14 and 15. "But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, 'Permit the children to come to me. Do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it at all.'" So they see children as a nuisance, and Jesus says, no, these are the priority. You need to be more like the kids instead of expecting kids to be more like you. Reminds me of Mark 18. Starting in verse 1, it says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, 'Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And he called a child to himself and set him before them, and said, 'Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea.'" And we saw some of that last week in Mark 9. This is a similar account. But Matthew goes into a little more detail, which is why we're looking at Matthew 18. Down to verse 10. "See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven." And then down to 14. "So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." And so he says, this is what you need to be like. You want to be great in the kingdom, you have to be like a child. Don't cause the children to stumble. Remember that God has angels. He says that their angels in heaven continually see the face of God who is in heaven. So there's some sort of representative for those children with angels. And he says it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones perish. And so Jesus wants them to come to him because he does not want any of them to perish. He does not want any of them to be lost. And he welcomes them. And we see that children deserve demonstrated love. Verse 16. "And he took them in his arms and began blessing them, laying his hands on them. We also saw in Mark 9:35 through 37. It says, sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Taking a child, he set him before them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me does not receive me, but him who sent me. He gave them hugs. He showed them how much he loved them. He let them sit on his lap. He says that he began blessing them, laying his hands on them. Children deserve demonstrated love. Jesus didn't just say he loved these children. He showed it in how he interacted with them. He showed it. He showed his love for them. He showed that they were a priority in his life. So how does this apply to us today? Normally we look at it a little bit more passages, a little bit more of the verses and more points, but there's a lot of application today with just these little parts. There's so much we can learn from them. See, like I said, the Pharisees again come asking a question of Jesus. When they ask questions of Jesus, sometimes they're seeking to trap him, as I said. We even specifically get told that they were seeking to trap him. But other times they seem to just be trying to find out what his position is on a topic that was widely discussed and debated. And this might be one of those times. There were plenty of discussions about when it was okay to divorce and when it wasn't. For some, they interpreted finding a flaw in a wife to mean only something along the lines of adultery, and they were very strict about it. For others, though, it meant almost anything. That if you decided you didn't like the way she cooked something once, it was enough of a reason. It was similar to the no-fault divorce laws we see these days. You know, they can just say, well, irreconcilable differences. They don't have to go into detail. It used to be you had to really show a reason for divorce. But that's not normally the case anymore. Some, though, have taught that the issue here was merely that they were sending her away rather than giving a certificate of divorce. And that Jesus was condemning sending her away without the certificate, but not actually condemning divorce. That divorce was okay as long as you gave the certificate. There are multiple problems with this, though. First, Jesus asks the Pharisees about the law, and they mention the instruction, including the statement about a certificate of divorce. This should show that when they were asking the question about send him away, that they were including the certificate of divorce in that. Because when he asked them about it, they're like, yeah, it says send her away with a certificate, so it's okay to do that, right? As long as you give the certificate. And Jesus then states specifically that this entire instruction was based on their hardness of hearts. He says sending her away with or without a certificate of divorce was a display of hard-heartedness. We see that that's the case because he tells them that. And some say, well, no, he says he gave them the rule for the certificate because their hardness of hearts, they were going to send her away anyway, and the certificate gives something. But that's where the second part comes in. As we saw in another passage in Deuteronomy, Moses gives a similar instruction, but only mentions sending her away without mentioning a certificate of divorce in that instance. So is it that only a Jewish wife needs a certificate of divorce and a Gentile wife can just be sent away? Or is it that it's the general principle that he knew their hardness of hearts, and so he was telling them how to try and act as ethically as possible when still not doing what they were supposed to? Clearly, it's that the hardness of hearts wasn't about giving a certificate. It was about not staying committed to the marriage in the first place and looking for excuses to end the relationship. Third, Jesus states that marriage is a spiritual union between a man and a woman, sanctioned by God. And he states, what therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. A man giving his wife a certificate of divorce would still be a man trying to separate what God has joined together. It's not that if you write the certificate, then God separates. God joins them together through the uniting of flesh. And man is incapable of undoing that act once it has been done. Once the flesh has been joined, it's been joined. You don't unjoin it. That lasts, even if the marriage doesn't. So what we see here is that God is the one that defines marriage, and thus God is the one who sets the terms of marriage. And this is important as we look at the application today. Instead of just what the historical issue is, but how does it also apply today? Because many people want to redefine marriage today. Some want to change it from a man and a woman being married to include a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. Some want to redefine it by declaring it an open marriage, and that being married doesn't prevent sex outside of marriage as long as the other spouse approves of it. That it's not adultery because it's not cheating, it's not behind the back, that they're giving permission and so it's allowable. But that's not the case. There's even a lawsuit in New York right now of a parent and child suing to allow them to be legally married. That they naturally love each other and so they should be allowed to be legally recognized as husband and wife. All these things go against what God says about marriage and how God defines marriage. But more often than redefining the individuals involved in marriage, people are more likely to ignore or redefine the terms of marriage itself. Hebrews talks about honoring the marriage bed and that fornicators and adulterers God will judge. The word fornicators, as I said, refers to those who have sex outside of marriage. However, we see that it's paired with adulterers, which would be sex outside of marriage with at least one individual being married, which shows that fornicators is specifically referring more to premarital sex, and that it is an affront because it does not honor the marriage bed. So one way people don't recognize the importance of marriage is by not honoring it before getting married. Even though some have advocated for sex or living together before getting married in order to gauge compatibility and suggest that doing so will increase the odds of a marriage working out, the fact is that's just not true. Statistics show that those that have premarital sex or live together before marriage are more likely to get divorced. And divorce is the other major way that the terms of marriage often get redefined. Marriage is supposed to be a lifelong commitment, and divorce interrupts that. Paul in Romans talks about marriage being a lifelong commitment. He says that's why we have to die to sin, because we're married to sin, basically, and we need to die to sin in order to be married to God instead. Because he says after death, then it is no longer adultery to marry someone else. The fact is, divorce has become extremely common in society and in churches. People get married, they make their vows, but if it gets more difficult, if someone's unhappy, they decide to divorce. It's so easy. We think that if you marry based on love, that that's more likely to work out. The problem is most times when people marry based on love, it's based on emotion, not the deep intentional commitment that love really is. Statistically, if you look at societies that still do arranged marriages, they have a much lower divorce rate because they know that that's the marriage that they're going to be in, and so they are going to make that marriage work, and they're going to love whoever has been arranged for them because they They don't have much choice. It's because they recognize more of the commitment. So while we should love the people we marry, it needs to be a commitment to loving them even if you don't always like them. And divorce and the prevalence of divorce and how easy it is to get a divorce has made people look down on marriage and not honor the marriage bed the way they're supposed to. Because it's so easy and you can just find someone else that'll be a better person. Now, there are a couple biblical reasons for divorce. One is given by Jesus. He even talks about it a little bit here. And one by Paul. But the fact is that churches have hidden behind that in order not to address divorce at all. We say, well, there are some justified divorces, so we just, anytime there's a divorce, we just pretend like it must fall into the justifiable category and don't ask questions. And that's allowed divorce to become more prevalent in churches. The fact is, the vast majority of divorces, though, do not fall in that category. Jesus says divorcing other than for adultery is wrong. But he never says that if there is adultery, that people have to get divorced. It's permissible, but still better if things can be worked out and the marriage maintained instead. Paul says if a believer is married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever wants to get divorced as a result, that the believer can grant it. But he also tells the believer not to seek out a divorce and to remain in the marriage if possible. So even with the exceptions, they are still to be avoided if at all possible, because marriage is a sacred gift. Marriage, as I said, is in fact an institution that existed before sin even entered the world. It also is an example of the relationship that we are to have with God. One of the reasons that we are to honor it so much is because it is so representative of the greatest thing we can get, that relationship with God. As such, the divorce for infidelity thing is a really powerful example. God talks about divorcing Israel and Judah because they continue to be unfaithful. But he also had Hosea give a powerful example of how if they would become faithful again, that he would welcome them. Sin is us being unfaithful to God. And even though he would be within his rights to stop having a relationship with us as a result, he seeks reconciliation instead. He's done everything he can to have an eternal relationship with us. Aren't we glad that he doesn't jump to divorce as easily as society does? Of course, divorces do happen. Even when people seek to avoid them, sometimes they happen. But we need to be careful about how we talk about divorce. If a couple were fighting constantly, we might be tempted to say, for them it was better to get divorced. I know divorce isn't good in general, but in this situation, people just weren't happy. It's better for them. They're happier now. Life isn't about happiness. Life is about a relationship with God and submitting to God and loving God and loving others. Happiness is fleeting. Oftentimes there are things that don't make us happy in the short term, but in the long term they provide joy, which is greater than happiness. The fact is, saying that two people fighting, that it's better for them to get divorced, the fact is that isn't biblically true. So if it's not biblically true, it's not really true at all. It's just not true. Saying that is just a way to try and justify something, which sounds a lot like what the Pharisees were doing when Jesus says, it's because of your hardness of hearts. We try and justify our hardness of hearts too, don't we? Maybe it's in our handling of divorce specifically. Maybe it's other ways that we try and just cover for our own hardness of hearts and justify it. The fact is, what would be better for them is to recommit to the relationship and to sacrificial love and to work it out. Maybe finding counseling in order to overcome it. The fact is, God can work all things for the good of those who love him. And so, even out of something like divorce, good can eventually come. But that doesn't mean the divorce itself was good. And even if a person ends up in another committed marital relationship in the future, that doesn't mean that a non-biblically justified divorce before then becomes a good thing. Becomes a bad thing that good resulted from. It's still a sin that needs repentance. But it also ends up in the past. And it itself is not a constant sin. So it's important to move forward with life, trying to avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But we need to acknowledge that it was a sin. And that our attitude needs to change. If we want to learn from the mistakes in the past, part of it is changing how we look at it. And say, yes, I acknowledge that was a sin. And I'm committed to doing better. After that, we see Jesus interacting with children. The disciples saw the children as a bother, and they tried to block him. But Jesus saw them as the most important people. What about us? Do we sometimes think kids are being too noisy or too rowdy? Do we see them as a bother? We shouldn't. At a previous church, we had a bunch of kids come for a game night and for Bible lessons. They didn't go to church anywhere on Sundays, and their parents weren't Christians, and many of the kids came from broken homes. I had people tell me that the kids were being too noisy, and that when they had kids, their kids knew how to behave properly in church. And why didn't these kids know that? That made me sad for a couple reasons. One reason was because these kids weren't raised in churches. So expecting them to know how to behave in church when they hadn't had godly teachers was a problem. We should be happy they were there. That they were wanting to learn more about following Christ. And boy, were they enthusiastic about learning. At least most of them. The other reason it made me sad was that the people that would compare those kids to their own kids and criticize how the current kids were being raised had raised kids that no longer ever attended church. So it made me sad to think that they were praising themselves for teaching their kids how to behave in church when they hadn't even managed to teach their kids how to be in church. Or even more importantly, to be the church. Like, I raise my kids better. You can tell by the fact that you've never met them because they never come. I'd rather have kids that are a little bit rowdy, that love learning more about Jesus, than kids who sit quietly and never end up in a relationship with him. You know, I've got to say, I am so thankful to see the kids that we have here. They're great kids. They're fun to talk to. I love seeing their enthusiasm for learning more about God. They're not a nuisance. They're a blessing. They are what the kingdom of God is supposed to be like. We need to do everything that we can to help more children learn about Christ and not to hinder them. One of the things we're doing next month to encourage kids to come to Jesus is VBS. I hope that we will get many volunteers to help out with VBS. I hope everybody here will be praying for VBS. I hope that people here that know kids invite those kids to join us for VBS. I also hope that we don't see our commitment to kids as only being needed during VBS, but that we find ways to encourage them throughout the year too. Another thing about kids' faith that ties in with the previous thing is that divorce has a devastating effect on kids. and it can especially have a spiritual effect on kids. An involved father makes a single grace impact on a child's life, development, and spiritual status of any relationship. But in divorces, the majority of the time, the way they are set up leads to a father being primarily or totally absent from the children's lives. The importance of a mother and a father in a child's life is another reason why God was so protective of marriage, because he is so protective of children. In situations where the father isn't around, whether because of divorce or death, it's important to have spiritual father figures that can help fill the gap for a child's development and encouragement. We conclude this part of Mark 10 by seeing that Jesus welcomed them into his arms and blessed them. When he looked upon Jerusalem, he lamented that he wanted to gather Jerusalem into his arms, but they were unwilling. The children, though, ran toward him with love, and he greeted them with open arms. How can we show kids how much we love them? How do we ensure that we do love them and their actions are out of the overflow of our heart and they're not just us trying to go through the motions? How do we seek to bless the children in our lives? When I was at the other church, I talked to some of the people that were unsure at first about the kids. I told them to know them is to love them. Just try and get to know them, and you'll see. A couple of them decided to try. And it didn't take very long at all until they were gushing over the kids and looking forward to seeing the kids each week and getting hugs and telling them how much they loved them. And I would hear them start telling the other adults, to know them is to love them. Jesus knew that to know children is to love them. Children need love to grow up healthy, physically, mentally, and spiritually. We are called to love them, and I can assure you that if we answer that call, we will find that it isn't a bother or a burden, but a joy. We will receive a blessing like we can't even imagine. Let the little children come to Jesus, and do not hinder them, for such is the kingdom of heaven. So let us welcome them with open arms, and let us remember a bit more of how to be like them, with their joy, their love, their excitement, their faith, and their wonder. If you're not a Christian and you want to become a child of God and enter into that relationship with him, or if you are a Christian but you found yourself not being faithful or not demonstrating that love, then contact me and we'll talk. We'll find a time to meet and talk about what it means to be a Christian.